And we are live, and I am joined again by my favorite people, Jose Luis Granados Ceja and Kurt Hackparth, most famously, to me anyway, of the Soberanía Mexico Politics podcast, but also of Canal Once, which is a news network in Mexico, and a few other million things that they do and write up. Kurt's doing a book fair this week where he's like making books and selling them and stuff. It's super cool. They are Renaissance men of all sorts of things. But
promoting some great authors from Oaxaca.
yes, which sounds delightful and like a place that I would rather be right now. But we are gathered here today to discuss some things going on in the Latin America region and dispel misinformation, as we love to do because we're real tired of it. I was encouraged to see, before we went live, Kurt and I were discussing this a little bit. I was encouraged to see that in the wake of the Jalisco situation, which we'll get into in just a second, that it was the response in some of the independent media was not all your typical, oh my gosh, the world's on fire. There was quite a bit of complexity and pushback, and let's all remember where these weapons came from for the cartels to be able to, do these violence and that sort of thing. And I was like, wow, we are learning. We are learning slowly. So that was good. And at least my algorithm seemed to understand that I didn't have time for the nonsense. So I was very pleased about that. But anyway, gentlemen, do you want to introduce yourself for those who are listening now and will be listening later, especially if they have not experienced your wonderfulness before?
Sure. My name is Jose Luis Granados Ceja. I cover Latin America for Dropsite News. And I'm also a presenter on Sin Muros, which is a show that looks at the U.S.-Mexico relationship here, produced by Canal Once in Mexico. So if there's any Spanish speakers out there, you can check it out. And of course, Soberanía, which is actually the only English language podcast that comes out on a weekly basis that covers Mexico and Latin America. So if you want to learn more about the region, that's a good place to start.
And it's the best. Kurt?
And my name is Kurt Hackparth, writing for Jacobin magazine in the United States. I'm just going to do the same spiel at the beginning as we do at the beginning of Soberanía. I write for Jacobin magazine on Mexico and Latin America. Get the guns up. Canal Once here in Mexico City. I'm on Sin Muros with Jose Luis and also on a weekly panel show called Masio Sare. So, ready for an episode of Gate with the People.
Oh my gosh. That was
it's a crossover. We're doing a crossover. It's like the sitcoms of old. Yep.
It's the best crossover ever. I'm so honored that you guys will cross over with me. Oh, look, we have fans. Hello, fans. All right. So first on the agenda is the Mexican government. And I think that's the important details I hammer on. The Mexican government, led by the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum,
with the Mexican Army and the Mexican National Guard.
With their sovereign...
The Mexican lives.
With their sovereign forces. Even Caroline Leavitt was very clear that that's what happened. And she's not very good at telling the truth. So that was kind of beautiful. But they executed, I believe it was originally an arrest warrant, right, on El Mencho, and then it turned into a showdown, and he was shot in the standoff. And I believe... I forget if the reporting was that he actually died on the scene or if he died later in the hospital or something like that. But they had, but he perished, obviously. And in the wake of that, the cartel did a fairly predictable response, which was to block roads, set cars on fire to do so. And the initial video coming out of Jalisco was, cars on fire, yada, yada, yada. And it was very clear that the mainstream media, their goal was, of course, to be like, look at Mexico being crazy again. Like, that was obviously the narrative. And as I said, I was actually very encouraged when I saw that people were not really swallowing that hook, line, and sinker. There was a lot of like, let's not forget why the cartels are the way that they are. Also, yes, as a guest is pointing out right here, there was also some attempt by Trump to say that he took out El Mencho, especially in the State of the Union, which I was in the Capitol building during this State of the Union in the basement, one of the little caverns back down there. And it was literally, he said that, and I got this text from my husband. Gentlemen, this is how well trained my husband is now on Mexican politics. And he was like, get Claudia Scheinbaum's name out your mouth and stop taking
Right.
credit for what she did.
That's
And I
right.
was like I've never been more in love with you than I am right now. So it was really hilarious. But anyway, all that set up, what was actually going on in Jalisco? Because as far as I can tell, we had a day of stuff, and then it was pretty much done. And to my knowledge, the cartel has not risen up and caused anyone to enact martial law or anything of the sort. So please tell us what the reality is on the ground so far.
Sure. So I'll just do a very brief overview, and then Jose Luis can jump in. What happened on Sunday, as you well said, it was an operation against El Mencho. El Mencho was the head of the cartel, was the head of Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is one of the relative newcomers on the cartel scene. It's only about 15 or so years old. Obviously, begun in the state of Jalisco, hence the name, but has extended its operations to other parts of the country as well. El Mencho was a very bad guy, violent, wanted criminal. Everyone's in agreement on that point, right? So what we saw on Sunday was an operation, as you said, to execute a warrant for El Mencho, which turned into a firefight, and which in turn actually into a chase and a shootout. And he was captured and killed en route to the hospital, along with several other members of the cartel. As you very rightly said as well, this led to a very predictable response on the part of the cartel, and that for a number of reasons, which we actually talked about on the podcast this week. First of all, because the cartel at that point is trying to block roads and block access because they didn't know if this was going to be kind of a general attack, a general sweep against the entire cartel or not. So they try to isolate themselves. It's also an attempt to show force in a moment of weakness when they decapitate the head of the cartel. And it also, could be the first feints or movements of an incipient turf war, which is what tends to happen when, the leader of a cartel is killed. Think of the U.S. mafia, right? It's not like the U.S. doesn't have, its own phenomena.
How dare you? We don't have
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
How long has the U.S. been at war with the mafia? How's that gone? A
We've
lot of movies.
arrested exactly one of them for tax evasion, to my knowledge. I do not
Yeah.
believe we have ever successfully captured that many more of them. So there you go.
But the demand, of course, is that Mexico eliminate organized crime
Right.
immediately,
Completely.
instantly.
Right now.
Right. Right. Weapons grade military coming from the north, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. So, very much like when we were talking last fall about the supposed Generation Z march in Mexico City, which led to a series of overhyped social media posts and tweets about supposedly things being out of control in the Zocalo of Mexico City. On Sunday, you just had just a crazy fest of fake news online, where Mexican right-wing accounts created fodder for Trumpist accounts in the U.S. And so you saw not like our lovely crossover, but a very ugly crossover of Mexican far-right tweets and um, people like Laura Loomer and the like in the U.S. Right. So just to give you a few examples, just to get things going, right? You had one of the two main anchor people in Mexico, Javier Alatorre, one of the two main television news anchors, saying that there were shots being fired in the Guadalajara airport. Not true. It wasn't true. It wasn't true, right? You had other people sharing supposed photos of a plane on fire at the Guadalajara airport. Artificial intelligence. Not true. You had AI photos of Puerto Vallarta totally in flames, right? We're talking about a few burned cars, right? And, I could go on, right? There were accounts here saying that, you know, um, cartel members had taken over the airport. It was the worst act of narco terrorism in the history of the country, on and on. So then that jumps the border, and you get Laura Loomer saying that they were taking U.S. citizens as hostages.
Not a thing.
I mean, it just, I wrote an article about this in Jacobin 4 years ago about how, the right in both countries coordinate back and forth, but it's gotten that much more fast decentralized, and virulent over the last 4 years because of AI. Because now you can make up any image, any, fake video, whatever else, and take off from there. Right. When what really happened was actually a very successful operation.
That hurt.
Oh, there we go.
That
So I'll just
does.
finish up really quickly. Just, tragically, 25 members of Mexico's armed forces lost their lives,
Mm,
right? As we always say, the Mexicans put their lives on the line and the Americans put military grade weaponry that killed them.
mm,
But by Tuesday, most of the roadblocks and the burnt cars had been removed and things were mostly back to normal.
right.
And that should have been the story. But that's not the story that you want to hear in the US because you want the story that Mexico is a basket case in order to justify destabilizing the country and justifying US interventionism.
Correct. Which is
I'll pick
why
up exactly on that point.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say this is why leftists, I'm not really leftist, but like left-leaning accounts like mine and like yours and whatever need to do these crossovers to also combat the Laura Loomers crossing over with your anchors and whatnot. So,
Exactly.
Jose Luis, go ahead.
Understood, yes. I was going to say, when you see these disinformation campaigns, the first question you should ask yourself is who benefits from it, right? And one of the interesting things about this operation is that it's a bit of a departure from Claudia Sheinbaum's strategy.
Mhm.
So the whole war on the cartel started in 2006 under the right wing Mexican president Felipe Calderon, who had his top security, his right hand man, actually in bed with organized crime. He's serving a sentence in the United States for it. But he's kind of the one who started this whole war inside of the country, generating this internal conflict. And very much of his strategy was kind of defined by the kingpin method, which is try to cut off the heads of these organized crime groups, fracture them, and then when they're smaller and weaker, break them apart. Ultimately, that didn't work, right? That was the strategy that was employed by him and his successor, Enrique Peña Nieto. It was actually Lopez Obrador who kind of changed the security approach. In fact, that's when you stopped hearing about a war and said it was about trying to secure peace in the country. And the emphasis under Lopez Obrador was far more on kind of the root causes of violence, right? The social exclusion, particularly in the countryside, the marginalization of youth, the fact that they didn't have any kind of opportunities. Many of them essentially felt like they had no choice but to affiliate with organized crime groups, et cetera, et cetera. And his strategy was criticized for a really long time because of a campaign slogan, essentially, which is where he talked about hugs, not bullets, abrazos, no balazos. And the idea wasn't that we're going to hug the criminal elements of society, but hug the members, the potential recruits of them, right? To give them job opportunities, job training programs, right? Scholarships for education so that they feel like they had another option without necessarily putting all the emphasis on security forces on the street. Now, Claudia Scheinbaum, and hopefully she's not listening, but she would probably never agree for domestic political considerations that her strategy has been a slight departure from Lopez Obrador's in the sense that she's preserved the social programs, of course, and in fact expanded them, announced critical new social programs that are going to be reaching some of these same communities throughout Mexico. Again, emphasizing mostly the countryside, which was abandoned during the neoliberal period. Like, figure it out. Let's see if you can still survive. Either you migrate to the cities or migrate to a different country or you join organized crime. But she has taken a more muscular approach. So she's also putting a lot more emphasis on investigation and collaboration within agencies to try to kind of give more impact to the actions of the security forces. So it's not just about the low level, affiliates, the people who we call them halcones, right? The people who are on the street corners watching things, or kind of the small scale trafficking. No, the big players and what makes them powerful. So the flow of money and guns. And that's why there's also an emphasis on investigation. That has been her security strategy. She hasn't really gone for the kingpin strategy, but clearly makes the decision in this one to go after, well, who is arguably the most important target in Mexico,
Right.
possibly worldwide when it comes to
One of the most in the world, yeah.
Yeah.
It said his organization had tentacles everywhere. They were obviously concentrated in the state of Jalisco, but, had a certain presence in the majority of the country, if not the entire country, although obviously with disputes with other groups. And so I think in part, the motivation was this would be a big blow, right? Like, but really the thing that convinces me, because I don't think that the kingpin strategy has proven effective in Mexico's history. What it does is essentially create more violent elements because they're kind of competing to prove that they're the next big thing, right? The next big shot. I think the key thing about this, and the thing that really convinces me that it was the correct decision to take, is the fact that it sends a message to to Washington right now, to the White House, to the Trump administration, to tell them that this notion that some of them have and are waiting for the moment to implement, to use unilateral military action inside of Mexico, be it by boots on the ground or the use of drones or U.S. aircraft, is not necessary. It's the clearest message she could send from her government to Trump's to say, we've got it. And I do think it's really important in that sense. It allows them in all of these high level, closed door negotiations that Mexico has constantly, right? I'm always surprised when we kind of hear about a phone call that Trump and Sheinbaum had. Apparently, they're talking all the time. They had
Mhm.
one this week, but we don't always hear about it. So they're constantly in communication. In those rooms, they can say, you need to lay off this request for you, because Trump brings it up almost every time. I want
Mhm.
to send troops, and he always classifies Scheinbaum's reason for it, saying, "Oh, she's scared." It's not, right. Like, I think for your viewers here who are, curious about some of the political culture in Mexico, that's a red line for most of the Mexican population. The last time U.S. troops came into Mexico, except for the time they were chasing after Pancho Villa, they
Mhm.
stole half the territory. It's a sensitive subject. We're not comfortable with the idea of foreign troops pretty much for any reason aside from training. And even then, it's controversial
Right.
to be on Mexican soil. So
Yeah.
there's no interest in that. And this, I think, really allows her to say, we're not going to accept this. And I think actually works really well because it is a convincing case to be made. But of course, to go back originally to what I was saying, when you see this disinformation campaign and when it taps into that right wing kind of media ecosystem, that's because there are actors in there who are activating their various different players that they have in in the same ecosystem to try to still portray Mexico as lawless, as in need of intervention, and all of this. And that's why we saw such a big amplification of these AI generated images, because the operation itself actually served to really shatter that narrative that an intervention is necessary. So that for me is like the biggest takeaway in terms of what happened and why you saw this campaign. It was kind of unprecedented. I also think it's probably tied to two really important elements. One being right wing political networks here in Mexico who want to try to leverage the security issue in this country to score political points, to try to become relevant again, because as we've talked a lot about on your show, there's basically no real opposition here. They're incompetent and they're unable to really present a political alternative. So they try to find things that so that they can kind of latch onto and become popular. The other one is criminal elements. It's quite likely that criminal elements themselves were
Mhm.
participating in this artificial amplification of their capacity because they could win from being able to say, look how strong we are. The state can't handle us, because they have to kind of think about their own propaganda. So the fact that so many people fell for it, I think should cause them to pause and say, I am like essentially playing into the game of organized crime groups themselves.
Right. Thank you for, laying that out so beautifully. I'll double click for, I saw some people just join, so I'll double click on a few things just to make sure that the point is clear. Um, the way to deal with organized crime is to go after what feeds into organized crime. As you said, desperate people, desperate economic times create the natural feedback loop for organized crime to have enough bodies to be as terrorizing as they are. Going after that under AMLO's administration and continuing that under Scheinbaum's administration cuts off the source. So they do not have the manpower that they need in order to continue. So that's point one. Point two, Trump has continued this nonsense narrative like every week that he can possibly squeeze it in there of I offer my troops, I offer my resources, she never wants it. I'm sort of impersonating him, even though it makes me kind of gag. And she never says, yeah, she never will take my offer. And this is President Scheinbaum saying, "I don't need you. I can run this country just fine. Thank you so much." Which I've said this before during one of our previous crossovers. I am scared of Claudia Scheinbaum. Like, I would never like do something to cross her because I just get the sense that she is just one of those quiet people who can handle everything just fine and does not require, the theatrics and whatnot, and is perfectly happy with that. I also saw a
Just
comment.
as a little bit of a anecdote, we know people in the Shine.
Oh no, Kurt.
We lost him when he was about to drop some gossip.
I know.
Oh, here it is. I was cut off by the security forces.
Yeah.
We know people in the Scheinbaum administration who have to go and make their presentations to where she is intimidated.
Oh
That's
yeah,
what
no,
everybody says.
I get
Just
it.
one withering look is enough to make somebody crawl away with the
I'm
PowerPoint
sure.
presentation they worked 3 weeks on.
Right. She seems incredibly sweet and wonderful. Like, the people
Yeah.
clearly love her, and I'll talk about that in just a second because I saw a comment in the feed here. Like, she obviously loves her people and loves her job, but I also don't think that she brooks any bullshit. Like, it's like
Well,
just
she knows not only her brief, but she knows everybody else's brief. So you'd
right,
see her at the Mañanera press conference. She not only knows her own stats from
right,
the presidential office, but whenever any one of her cabinet ministers is expounding on something and they get a number wrong, she's right there behind them saying, "No, it wasn't this; it was that.
that one.
No,
Right,
that was that.
right.
Don't forget to say that, and be quick about it."
Yes, and please move on. We have things
Yeah.
to I have a country to run.
Mhm.
I really like she is one that I would kill for like a day of just like learning by her side. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. She doesn't know who I am, and that's probably weird. Um, someone said, "Mess with Claudia at your own peril." Exactly. I saw one that said like, "How does the Mexican public view Claudia Scheinbaum?" And her approval is high. In fact, to your point, Jose Luis, the one place where she might have had some vulnerability in her approval is security, is the cartels, and honestly, I'm waiting to see how that changes after Sunday. I'm like, maybe
Well, we actually have some initial numbers on
do
that.
we?
There was a
Okay.
poll that just came out from De Las Eras, which is a fairly respectable polling company in Mexico.
Mhm.
88% of Mexicans were supportive of the operation, or 80, yeah. And 56% of those respondents said that their opinion of Sheinbaum has actually gone up as a result. So that's when you see this real delinking between what the Mexican public saw in large majorities on Sunday, and what you're hearing from these hysterical accounts.
Yes.
Some of
Yeah,
them in
yeah,
bad faith, and some of them just because they got carried away.
right.
The problem is when you have a stereotype as deeply rooted as the anti-Mexican stereotype, it gets activated in these moments, and there are bad faith people, but there are other people who just get carried away with it because it's just deeply rooted in their unconscious that Mexico is a basket case. And so it couldn't be anything else but that. Right? It's the sepia filter
Yes.
that's all internalized, right?
Yeah.
So actually, that's the difference there. And just to your point really quickly about, weaponry, we've talked about this on the show, but
Mm.
it's not only private US weapons manufacturers.
Yeah, no.
It's
It's
a public
right.
plant in Kansas City
Mm.
that produces that 50 caliber ammo. That's the armor piercing stuff. That's a public plant. They could stop that tomorrow.
Right.
It's not even a question of regulating a private market. They could stop that tomorrow.
Correct.
But they've actually allowed that plant to sell their spillover ammo into the private sector. And guess where it gets to? Right down here.
Right.
And you know what? What the worst thing about that is, because this report that brought it up, they obviously asked people connected to this plant, well, how do you justify this if you're finding out that these bullets are ending up in Mexico and arming these violent groups? They're like, well, it saves taxpayer money. That's their justification for it. And in
Mhm.
fact, just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, Claudia Sheinbaum at her morning press conference talked about it. She's like, "You want to help us stop the flow of guns, stop
There we
the
go.
flow of bullets. This is what's
Mhm.
actually arming them."
Right.
23,000 weapons have been seized just since the beginning of this administration. 80% of them, according to the Mexican Defense
Yes.
Secretary, come
Mhm.
from the US.
Yep.
So if they want to
And a
help
lot of them
with
are traced back to that Lake City plant. We can have the public option in ammo, but we don't get a public option in healthcare.
Cor
It's a public effing plant.
yeah, well, that's a whole a whole other thing. And something else that was brought up in the comments that I definitely also wanted to make sure I covered, and there was also a report. This week was full of reports that were so timely with this operation and everything. I think it honestly ended up really hurting the rights case because they were trying very hard to make, like you said, the basket case of Mexico and like, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And then like literally in the same week was the report about the firearms confiscation, like how much of it was actually, from the US and public for that matter, not even just private, but also the drug consumption and, and the source and everything. It's like, where are the customers for the narcotics in the first place? They are not in Mexico. Y'all don't have a culture that really is like about drug
Not
usage.
hardly at all.
That
Hardly at
doesn't
all.
mean it doesn't exist. It just is not compared to the US. I mean, we are like we are the buyers. And it's not just Mexico. We are the buyers of all sorts of things from everywhere. I feel like we're, the vice capital, quite frankly, of the entire planet. It is, and I'm not saying that because I hate my country. I'm saying because it's reality. Like that's just what it is. Like when you have all this money and you don't know what to do with it. I mean, I know what to do with it. I would like public health care, but like that's beside the point. And so yeah, I really it ended up
But you
being
can get public ammo. You can get public ammo. That exists.
stop,
That's
Kurt,
big ammo.
doing it in.
We'll see. Yeah.
So you can get on a boat and invade Cuba with heavy weapons. Yeah.
Oh God, we'll get into that in just a second. But yeah, no, I felt for someone who's a data nerd like me, it really turned into a week where I didn't feel like I had to go in comment warrioring or making a bunch of videos about it. I literally just posted to my stories like all of these studies and headlines that were coming out with all of this information, and like I said, I was very gratified to see that at least in my algorithm, in my feed, there were a lot of voices I had never heard before, but voices coming out and saying, let's just remember what the root causes of all of this are. And by the way, Jalisco's fine. It's all done. And the only reason some of you Americans were getting all pissy about it is because it was Puerto Vallarta. Like that was the only reason, is because it's a big tourist destination. And so some of you were uncomfortable on your vacations. So sorry. I was really surprised by some of the very direct messaging that like people were not bullshitting any of this. They were like, no. We're not gonna do all this and get all spun up, with the AI videos and whatever. And it was nice. I was like, oh my God. Because I've told you guys before, the first couple of times that I tried to say anything nice about Mexico on my particular channels, I got lambasted. Like, don't you know that it is a cartel like country and like a narco government and all this kind of stuff? And I remember just being like, what have I done? But instead I just leaned in, and now I'm very glad that I did. Amazing. So first of all, yay, President Scheinbaum. Thank you so much. I really think that what I was taking away from, seeing the news and looking at the data is that she is making a very strategic decision that now we can kind of do both. And like, we've dealt with a lot of the social issues. We're still dealing with a lot of the social issues. We can display a little bit more force now, right? Like we can like kind of pincer this in now and make it clear like, oh, I have the ability to arrest you if I need to. And if I have the evidence and I figured out where you are and like all this kind of thing. It was I think a lover or something was the informant or something.
It was a lover.
Yeah. So once I have my things, I can get you at the top. And again, as we said earlier, cutting off the source of your manpower in the first place, and you become just weaker and weaker as we go along. And as you guys stated, it's not like organized crime is a Mexican unique issue. Like, we have organized crime here in the US. Some of them wear very fancy suits and ties and go to Epstein's Island on a regular basis. I mean, I really find it just so bizarre that we're trying
Or
to
some
like
of them wear elite military uniforms and are at Fort Benning.
that part. But I do find it bizarre how we've tried to claim the moral high ground so many times in light of the Epstein class, as we've been referring to them over here.
Fort Bragg, sorry. You get that Fort Bragg.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I knew what you meant. I wasn't even like paying attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, North Carolina. But in light of the Epstein class, I'm like, we have no moral high ground over here. we have a lot to fix over here before we get to go wagging our finger at other countries and telling them what they should and should not do with their own militaries and with their own, criminal organizations. So, anyway, and lecture, as I like to say in all my videos. All right, moving on. So we have a humanitarian crisis occurring. Probably even worse than Palestine is what I'm starting to gather, even though it's not getting nearly I would say, the media attention. And I'm not. This is not me denigrating or downplaying. Palestine is still very much being oppressed, and it's awful. And Netanyahu belongs in jail. I said what I said, but now we've got Cuba really in dire straits right now because once Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped and is still in New York, in case anyone was wondering, he is still up there. God knows what at this point is happening. And Venezuela was basically told to end all exports to Cuba, which that was their main importer. And for anyone who doesn't understand, like, oh, what's the big deal? This is Cuba's main source of energy. So anything that you need to plug in, anything that you need to turn on or whatever, oil is really the source for Cuba. And so we've got people who are like dialysis patients, not able to get their
Right.
dialysis. We have food rotting in fridges because people can't, whatever. And so you can see how this spins out very quick. Garbage is not being collected. And so now it spins out very quickly. And we are having a very significant humanitarian crisis in Cuba, completely made, like, manufactured by the US's intervention between Venezuela and Cuba. And as you guys have mentioned on your programming, Mexico has not been doing their own shipments of oil, though I think that's like maybe shifting a little bit. And then this week, President Trump said, "Oh, I'll allow imports to private importers only in Cuba," which is not really a thing. So it's just kind of like a word salad for him to pretend like he's not doing a really honestly illegal blockade against a country without actually declaring war, without congressional approval, without all this stuff. So, what would you guys like to highlight in this really pretty tragic crisis? Because this is not okay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the United States is setting up a situation in Cuba that has the potential to be an even larger humanitarian crisis than what we've seen in other parts of the world, including Palestine. It is a means of trying to asphyxiate a population, quite literally, economically, in order to get them to try to, on the one hand, either overthrow their own government, which has been the basically de facto US policy since the 60s to promote suffering in order to cut down the popularity of the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution, or to basically twist the arm of the government itself so much by causing widespread suffering that they make a deal that is not actually in their interest, right? And all of this is because of the bloodthirsty drive of people like Donald Trump, of course, but also Marco Rubio,
Yeah, I
who's
was
obsessed with
that
the idea. I mean, every time we talk about Cuba, I always mention this fact. In his own autobiography, when he was trying to be president, confesses that he used to dream about leading an army of exiles in order to install himself as president of Cuba. I mean, I think what we saw very recently with this vote, it looks like, based on the evidence we have so far, that some radicalized individuals
yeah,
live in the cesspool in southern Florida of anti Cuban politics,
yeah,
who are obsessed. Even one of the participants' brothers said as much, that he was obsessed with this idea of trying to quote unquote liberate or bring freedom
right,
to Cuba, actually bought a bunch of guns, got on a boat, and tried to invade the country. This actually happens surprisingly frequently.
right,
This is not the first instance of Cuba having to repel these kinds of invasions by the exile community from Florida. But this one turned deadly because, according to the Cubans, this boat was within 1 nautical mile of their coast. They were intercepted by the Coast Guard, asked them to identify themselves, and they responded with fire. So, of
right,
course, the Cuban Coast Guard returned fire, killing 4 of them and injuring some of them. A total of 10. Their names have now been published by the Cuban government. And it's just a symptom, I think, of this really radical view that exists in South Florida, who have what they believe to be an unshakable ally in Marco Rubio and Donald Trump, and therefore are capable of taking these kinds of really drastic actions. And in this case, it cost the lives of four of them. Because, of course, the Cuba has a right to defend its sovereignty and its territory. And if there's an invading group of exiles who shoot at them from their boat, then they're going to defend themselves. And, it's quite likely that the US actually was quite aware. At the very least, we know that as soon as they left Florida, Cuba basically had them spotted, gave them a heads up to the United States, and said, "We're worried about this. What's going on here?" And so I think that's why we've seen these kind of cagey answers from JD Vance and Marco Rubio.
Mhm.
They know exactly what kind of characters are involved in these kinds of things. This
Right.
wasn't a group of 10 men going out fishing. They were going to try to provoke an uprising in Cuba because they've been riled up by this really violent, aggressive position by the US government. They feel like this is their moment. We're going to finally topple the revolution. And some of them really went to these extremes. But it speaks to the US policy in general. I mean, what we're facing is a US government that is convinced that it has the right to overthrow a government that is inconvenient to it. I don't think that's going to happen in Cuba because Cuba is a country that experienced a very popular revolution in 1959. It's now been very well consolidated in society. There is, I think, a very small possibility, almost remote, less than 1%, of some kind of coup to oust the government there. Of them, the U.S. government claims that they're trying to find someone who can replace the current regime that they can work with. Trump hinted at this morning, but really, and I'll close on this. There's a lot of talk about discussions happening between Cuba and the United States, but as far as we know, those high-level negotiations are not actually taking. There may be some discussions. Apparently, there was something on the sidelines of the CARICOM summit in St. Kitts and Nevis where an official, not actually Marco Rubio, but associated with Marco Rubio, had a contact with Raul Castro's grandson, who's a key figure in the armed forces in Cuba. Maybe that can lead to a breakthrough because the Cubans obviously want to strike a deal. They understand the way that Trump works. They know that he is a kind of transactional kind of guy,
Mhm.
and that he doesn't want to be tarred with the label of having been responsible for one of the largest humanitarian crises in the hemisphere,
Mhm.
which would produce a huge exodus of Cubans that would land on the US's doorsteps. So they want to make a deal, but are the talks actually happening? It kind of sounds like they're actually not. We did some reporting at Dropsite where we were able to ascertain that no, in fact, these high level negotiations are not happening yet,
Okay.
that the Cubans want them to happen because there needs to be a solution to this. They are running out of fuel. This announcement that they made won't make much of a difference because basically state actors are banned, and the state actors are the key actors in terms of energy provision, energy generation in Cuba. So we'll see what happens next. But the important thing is that we don't take our eyes off Cuba, that we continue to accompany the country, that we show that we're in solidarity with it. And with that, I'll mention the Nuestra America Flotilla, which is going to arrive on March 21st in Cuba, setting up from Mexico, from the United States. People will be arriving there, meeting them, bringing supplies. It's a show of support from the world to Cuba.
Yeah, I heard about the flotilla, and I was very much like, "Oh, praise God." Because, I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, but it's at least going to hopefully prevent, mass loss of life and all that kind of stuff, which is like, you know, I'm always talking about harm reduction. I'm like, "Well, however we can reduce harm in the moment, that's what we need to do." While we work on the crazy people up top who are manufacturing crises for no reason. Marco Rubio, I think, is truly like, when I look at our cabinet, I'm always like, obviously hate them all. He strikes a really serious chord with me, just because I, I just, I just don't understand uh, someone who can look at what obviously he despises his home country. Like, obviously he does. That's clear. I don't understand though.
He's never been to Cuba.
No, I know. Like, I mean, sorry,
Like,
the country of, like, his origin,
And his
like,
yeah,
family left Cuba before the revolution.
right,
It's important that everybody know that very clearly.
right.
because he tries to
And
sell himself as the son of Cuban exiles. Like, just a
right,
few. but
Right.
his family actually traveled back and forth to Cuba without him, uh, even after Castro took over.
Right. So, yeah, so he has, like, this false narrative going on, but it's just, like, this is, like, you had family there, like, and I just don't understand, like, that level of malevolence and cruelty from that man. Like, I'm like, "You need assistance with something." I don't know what it is, I'm not a doctor, I can't help you with that, but it blows my mind every single time, and maybe that's naive, but it really does, like, every time he starts talking. But what struck me about him in this particular story with the speedboat, is how measured he was, because I was like, for someone who seems to be looking for the reason, you know what I mean? Like, looking for a reason, and I'm not saying he's measured. I'm saying how measured he was in public. Like, I was very taken aback that he did not go, "See, this is why we need to, like, whatever." And I was like, "Oh, bro, you know more of like, there's something going on here because, like, this is not an opportunity you would have passed up unless there is something very wrong with what happened with this boat." Like, I I was shocked when he was like, "We need to investigate and see what we see." And I was like, "Is this Marco Rubio or is this somebody?" Like, I was like, "Did he have a brain transplant? What's happening right now?" So that really struck me. And, I really the other thing that, I is kind of it's more I don't have a ton of evidence of this, but we're currently in a Department of Homeland Security shutdown right now. The Coast Guard is part of our Department of Homeland Security in the US, and I have to wonder, like, what some of that acting was, because even during a shutdown, the administration is able to say, "This is essential, this is essential, this is essential, it has to keep going," or whatever, and they have plenty of money. It's not the shutdown thing is a bureaucratic thing. It's really in practice, we don't have to act like it's this big deal, but anyway, whatever. Any excuse for Noam and Trump to be ridiculous. But all that to say, I really was just like, something is not right about this particular episode, because in any other world, Marco Rubio would have been like, this was what I needed, right, to get to start a war or whatever it is that, put himself on there as king or whatever it is that he thinks he's gonna do. And also just wondering, I was like in like the world we live in, there's no reason why this boat should have been able to do what it did without being intercepted far sooner
Much
than
older.
so it really is like there's clearly a lot of bodies buried along the way, and I'm very interested to see how that reveals itself eventually. But
You don't even have to take our word for it. Like, there's a Facebook profile that appears to belong to one of the individuals who was detained by Cuba, and you can see for himself images after images of his support for a group called Autodefensa del Pueblo, the self-defense of the people,
Hmm.
where they're engaging in acts of sabotage, where they're burning state-owned fields, where they're, actively trying to promote insurrectionary acts in Cuba and supporting these from abroad. I've listened to the interviews of some of the other people who were detained, where they talk about the need for the exile community to support all of these kinds of direct interventions. Or you can look at some of the other coverage that even sympathetic journalists from Southern Florida have published of these individuals, saying, well, they were just training in a farm with weapons and then they went to Cuba. They're not terrorists. I'm like, that's almost the definition
Right?
of
It's like
terrorism. So it's all out there. That's why, right, Marco Rubio is not quick to condemn. He knows these aren't innocent little fishermen who went over to Cuba to go visit relatives. They know exactly what they were up to, and it's
And
quite
it's
likely
also
just
part of the
another one of
larger
these radical groups.
it's also part of the larger phenomenon of even Rubio, right? And his ideological obsession is starting to feel the pressure of, the international community, to the point where they have to make this canard about allowing oil in, but the private enterprise, which is ridiculous. Because they're about to starve a whole island, right? Which even within that psychopathic obsession, some kind of pressure is getting in there. And it's part and parcel of the whole South Florida lobby. I mean, it's just nuts. I mean, we already made the comparison with Palestine, and how AIPAC runs the show to such a large extent with regards to Middle East policy. The South Florida lobby, I mean, it's just, have you seen what Carlos Jimenez, the representative, has been tweeting up? I mean, just insane rage tweeting, and directly at President Sheinbaum, right? Because there was a congressional interparliamentary commission that came down a few weeks ago,
oh, is that
and
the Is that the one about the
And
money?
she didn't receive them because it was never planned on him being received. And he starts rage tweeting. And everybody was dunking on him. And he wouldn't stop. It just got getting worse and worse and worse. He
until
felt like he could say
finally,
whatever crap he can want to make up about Mexico
Yeah.
and about Scheinbaum,
He's crazy.
calling her pathetic and in the hands of, dictators and whatever else. And then he also expects in the same breath for the doors of the National Palace to just be open to him. And what planet? And what planet should that happen? But we all know that they needed those votes for the big, beautiful bill. So, there they are. They've gotten free reign there. And it's also interesting that now that the tariffs have knocked down, well, the Supreme Court, and one logical thing they've done is knocked down the tariffs. Amongst them are the tariffs that Trump was threatening on China. And that actually came up in the Mañanera, the morning press conference the other day. Somebody asked President Sheinbaum point blank, now that the tariff threat with regards to Cuba is off the table, will you now be reconsidering sending oil? And she was kind of coy, but she said, we're considering our options. You know, they're trying to do the diplomatic work first of trying to convince some very irrational people that this is going to create a migrant crisis and a humanitarian crisis, and this is going to be, a black mark for all of history. But I think she's very clearly holding the card of emergency shipments of oil to Cuba in her back pocket as a reserve. The problem is, a quarter of the U.S. Navy is still parked in the Caribbean post Venezuela. What they haven't sent off you know, Iran, or which don't have their toilets clogged like the USS Gerald Ford, right? So it would be a risk. It would be a risk because they risk having the ship being seized or boarded, and then that being a pretext to bomb Mexico on land.
Yeah.
But it was very clear in the press conference that she was not taking that off the table of emergency shipments to Cuba, and the tariff threat is gone.
She I know I sound like a fangirl. I am, so I'll just own it. But, like, I really have been so impressed with how she has managed to, I know it's like the cool heads will prevail type thing, but it's not just about her having a cool head. She's just like, "I'm just gonna do the right thing. I'm not gonna be a big showboat about it. He can't actually pay attention to me all the time," right? Like, and so when he has been distracted by his toys over "Yes, Mr. President, okay, that's great, awesome, have a nice, good night, have a nice bedtime," or whatever, and then she just is gonna go do what she needs to do, right? Like, and she's not gonna, turn it into this whole she doesn't require that spectacle. I think she
Mhm.
almost uses Trump's need for spectacle and for adoration and whatever and show against him. Like, she's just like, "Cool, like, have your moment, say your say, have your tantrum. Once you're done and you're distracted with something else, I will be over here running my country the way that I wanna run my country. Thank you so much." And, like, um, and I really just, is Mexico part of BRICS? Or you're no, yeah,
No,
that's
it is.
Brazil,
Mhm.
yeah, it's other things. Um,
That actually came up. It's obviously come up in the context of all the Trump stuff, and Mexico's basically position is we're not joining BRICS in the short term, but again, that's another option. They're not fully taking off the table, but it's not happening in the short term.
yeah. So along those lines, this is a perfect segue. And I'll make sure to not keep you too much longer. The economic environment in Mexico, I think, is looking pretty rosy. And I'm not saying it's like, perfect and that there's no work to be done. But I think along the lines of what I was just saying, and we talked about this a little bit before we went live, I think that Mexico is doing an excellent job of staying out of some of the mire of what other countries are dealing with in their bilateral, and I put this in scare quotes, work with the US because, well, first of all, you are our closest trading partner. We do the most trading with you. And so there's only so much the US can do without hurting its own self. So that's number one, obviously. But number two is just, again, because she's not a showboat, because she's not gonna like run around screaming things from the sky. She's just gonna be like, okay, cool. Anyway, you know that you can't do that without hurting your own economy. Yes, awesome. So I'm gonna go do this over here. Thank you so much. Bye. Um, and and I think that obviously you guys are experiencing quite a bit of economic growth. And what for those who are listening, I sent Kurt an article from Bloomberg 2 weeks ago at this point now where it was an opinion piece, so take that for what you will, but it was really trashing on Mexico, saying how Mexico's economy was just like an absolute, you know, upheaval or whatever and something or other, which was really confusing to me because this exact same publication has been
Mhm.
putting out nonstop for like 6 months about how emerging markets are it. The US indexes are not keeping up with emerging markets, yada, yada, yada. And for anyone who's like, what's an emerging? I'm using jargon a little bit. Emerging markets are markets that are not like your classic US, China, like, major players. So when you're trading stocks or you're investing your 401k and you're looking at these baskets of ETFs and whatnot, you have like kind of the major players, like the top ones, the top Vanguard ones, and then you have emerging markets. And emerging markets have been taking off in the last year, whereas the markets that typically dominate, like US and such, are not. Um, and so anyway, Mexico is in the emerging market category. And so I found this article disingenuous just on its face. I was like, okay, so we already know emerging markets have been growing, even if obviously their, scale is not up to some of these US market forces. But also some of the article was just really cherry picking very specific data on purpose to ignore other things. So I would love, as much as you guys want to talk about, and I know you don't talk about economics like a whole heck of a lot, but I think it's worth mentioning some of the ways that the economic picture is looking pretty good in Mexico. And hashtag not a financial advisor. Don't listen to me. I'm just a girl on the internet, but I am going to be putting money into Mexican ETFs this weekend. Post haste. I was looking at their growth and I was really mad that I hadn't done it for the last year because they have grown a lot in the last year. And so I will be fixing that now. But anyway, with all that being said, what would you two like to say about the economy in Mexico and why we need to stop this narrative of you guys are just like these poor, unfortunate souls?
Well, I can talk to that Bloomberg piece because we kind of corresponded on it. This is kind of very standard hit piece from the financial press, which we've seen a lot here. So we kind of know the routine. On one hand, as you say, emerging markets are being talked up by the Bloomberg press and the like. But on the other hand, if it's an emerging market that doesn't behave, then of course they get the hit piece. And the not behaving in this case is that President Sheinbaum is uh, developing Mexico to what's called the Plan Mexico. And that's a public sector driven development plan. And Bloomberg hates that.
Yeah,
They hate that.
they
So they have to find a reason to say that it's bad. Now, is there private sector investment? Of course there is. Of course there is. Even in the energy sector, it's going to be a 54-46 division in between public and private investment.
Oh,
So
you
it's
mean
not
you're not a communist country? I'm sorry, I
not a,
thought
how
I
about that?
sorry.
Um, So, in order to try to twist the pretzel, right? They say things like a person familiar with the matter said, right? And we know this song and dance all the time. Anonymous sources said, but it was interesting that they couldn't even say a high-placed official in the Scheinbaum government or a high-placed official in the Trump. They couldn't even lie to that extent. They just said a person familiar with the matter. Well, who's that? Your greengrocer? I mean, who is a person familiar? Nothing against greengrocers, but I mean, who is the person familiar with them? That it could be your mom.
Right.
I mean, and that's how they base these articles, right? So you know, even the article had to admit that foreign direct investment is at an all-time high
Mhm.
in Mexico. It's at an all-time high. So how did they twist the pretzel? They said, well, it's not on completely new projects. Well, does it have to be on completely new projects? It's nice that there are new projects. I understand the case that you want to bring in just certain industries, which are called anchor industries, to then promote local, sustainable development around it. You don't want to depend entirely on foreign multinationals, which is a legitimate critique of the Plan Mexico. It's not just a question of bringing in Coca-Cola, slapping "Made in Mexico" labels on the bottles, and calling that part of the Plan Mexico. You want to be very selective about the anchor industries you choose to promote sustainable local, development, with obviously, Mexican supply chains, right? That's what you want, but it takes time, and it's hard to do when you've got Trump breathing down your neck every single day. So, that was the strange thing about that article, which also didn't mention until the very end of the piece, you know, a whole year of on again, off again tariff threats.
Right.
Like maybe that has an effect, right? But they just tried to isolate Mexico from a year's worth of economic uncertainty,
Right.
right? Just imagine, I'm a company. I want to invest in Mexico. Trump saying there's going to be tariffs. Then he said there isn't. Then he said there is. Then he said there isn't. Then he said 4 times. That's out of Mexico's hands. But according to Bloomberg, the fault is all on Mexico for these things. So that's just a few things to mention. We've gotten very used to parsing these kind of hit pieces because they come so often. But the bottom line is Bloomberg hates the idea of public sector driven development, with public dominance over the energy sector because they want in on that. So they have to find a way to justify that.
Yeah. Excellently said. I subscribe to all the wires, Bloomberg included, because it's helpful to keep my pulse on the things. But their biases towards private sector investment is like very clear. It's not a mystery, and I was so frustrated with the article from the outset because, again, I was like, you're belying the investing strategy that you and Goldman Sachs and everybody else are saying anyway, but also, really leaving out all sorts of other growths and areas. And like, let's just pretend private sector. I was just talking about the investment baskets. Like, even if we just look at the private sector for Mexico, growth over the last year, significant. Some of those indexes have grown like 200% over the last year. It's like, again, I was very mad that I wasn't investing sooner when I took a look at it today. So yeah, I really appreciate having so many more voices coming out of Mexico, including y'all's, that can counter this narrative of not just like the narco gobierno, which is very annoying and tired, and clearly people are starting to get tired of that as well, but also just the idea that you're some like backwater country that isn't doing anything. And I really get it's so irritating. And one of the reasons that I want to push back on it on my channel, because I think people look at it and they're like, why do you talk about Mexico and Cuba and whatever Latin America so much over there? It's because the things that we're seeing, policy-wise here in the US, immigration policy and whatever, all of that is fed by this bullshit, right? Like, if we think, Mexico is just some, like, narco-controlled, backwatered, economically unviable place, then the people who come from there must be less than, right? And then it's not
Right.
that far to humane detention and deportations without process and like all the bullshit that we're seeing. And so my whole thesis, whether anyone cares or not, is I want to dispel all this bullshit so that we can start treating each other like human beings again, and realize that also that the US is not the only exceptional country in the world. I am fine with people wanting to think that their country is exceptional. I think that that's natural. Like, we want the best for our country. And to act as if we have the copyright and the trademark on exceptionalism, yeah, there we go, is stupid. Like, that's a very dumb. So one thing that I love about your show is how the love of Mexico and all it is and all it can be. You don't do rose-colored glasses. You don't go like, we've made it, we're perfect, stop telling us what to do or whatever. But you do say stop telling us what to do, which is fine. But like, but you also are very clear of like, here's all the potential and here's how far we've come since 2016, and all that kind of thing. And even just how far you've come, since the failed attempts at sovereignty before, right? Like, all of you're in the fourth transformation because there's been some, as we talked about in our very first crossover, you've gone through some shit. And anyway, so anyway, that's just me hyping up like y'all and the country, and what the bilateral relationship could be if we would stop having Trump in the White House. Really, truly. Um, along those lines, now that I've expounded on all of that, any final thoughts from the two of you as far as what should be front of mind for the US, looking towards Mexico, looking towards Cuba, looking towards the Latin American region right now? Because there's a lot going on, as always. Trump is the master of like, let me set 15 fires so that no one knows what to look at. Is there anything that you guys want to be like, hey, in the next like month or so, you really need to be focused on X?
Well, the first thing to focus on is Cuba. I mean, this situation can be prevented, right? What is about to unfold, if nothing changes, can be stopped, but it has to be stopped through mobilization, through organization, through putting pressure on. I think it's symptomatic of a United States that is clearly interested again anew in the region that it views it strategically as important to an effort at global dominance. And we have an administration today that thinks, that the way that the international relations should be governed is that Mike Mate's right. And it's a huge departure from even the post World War II liberal consensus. That all of this is actually dismantling literally decades of what we thought was an understanding. So much, though, that even the Canadian Prime Minister makes a note of it, right? Has now publicly, loudly at Davos said how this system is falling apart. But he can say that, but where are the actions to actually reconfigure things and relationships so that middle income countries like Mexico, which, by the way, is the 12th largest economy in the world, right? Like, it's
Mhm.
not some backwater,
Right.
can actually be able to work with a country like Canada to break the blockade of Cuba, for example. We
Yeah.
actually have to put action behind some of these philosophies in terms of what this new world looks like. And that's true also of Latin American countries. There's been far too much of an emphasis on trying to save their own skins, of not actually developing a regional response and figuring out that united will actually be able to defend our sovereignty in a collective sense in the face of this very aggressive neighbor.
Right.
So my message to the United States would be to more so to its people, right? That you can play a major role. You can be a key factor in actually weakening the ability of the United States to engage in this kind of vulgar imperialism that we're seeing now, where they will kidnap a sitting head of state, where they will try to asphyxiate an entire country, where they will nakedly interfere in electoral processes. All of this can and should be changed. But for that, there has to be a political change, I think, inside of the United States as well. Weaken the ability of the Florida lobby to have the influence that it does. Also, I'm not going to tell gringos who they should or shouldn't support. But I do think one of the targets of their campaign to fix their country has to not just be the Republicans, but the establishment Democrats
Correct.
who have allowed all of this to actually take place. How is it possible that we have this orange monster in the White House and there isn't really much of an opposition to speak of? Really, I mean, it should be obvious, I think, that this is the moment to be serious about resisting his agenda. Otherwise, we're going to keep paying the price for it. The peoples of the global south are going to continue to suffer under the heel of US imperialism. And that is not a sustainable situation either, right? It's going to produce, likely what I expect in over the medium term, a backlash. And the truth is, we do actually have to share this hemisphere. We do actually have to get along. And the only way to do it is as equals, not as one country acting like it's better, stronger than all the rest of us, but actually sitting at the table as equals.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would closing statement.
Closing statement.
Just to finish on the
Closing argument to the jury.
closing argument, you have a minute, Mr. Heckler. No. Um, to finish on the economic point that we were talking about before, Mexico's macroeconomic numbers are strong. The peso is stable against the dollar at 17 to 1. Its deficits are under control. Its debt to GDP ratio is about 50%. What's the U.S. is up to? Up to 125% or
It's
so?
it's like 160, I think, at this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
So,
because our debt has skyrocketed in the last year. So,
mhm.
yeah.
Reserves are under control in Mexico. Investment is flowing. I think what Mexico needs to do is reduce interest rates. It's got a very restrictive monetary policy and a fairly restrictive fiscal policy because, global South countries simply can't take risks, right? Because the markets punish any slight deviation. So it would be great if Mexico could, loosen its monetary policy some, loosen its fiscal policy some more. But its numbers are strong. And that is with all of the infrastructure and social programs that have been happening. So it just goes to show that you can do, good books and also social programs at the same time. That's
Yeah.
a very important point. That's a very important point. And to Jose Luis's point, that's absolutely right. We're at a crisis point. Obviously, the United States is thrashing around. It's kidnapping heads of state. It's strangling Cuba. It's threatening to take us all into Armageddon with Iran from one day to the next. So things appear out of control, but it's because we're obviously at the end of one historical stage and we're at the beginning of a new one. So it's an incredible danger for the entire planet, but it's also obviously a real interesting opportunity to mold a world that is obviously more just than this one. And I don't think Mark Carney should be the one to take the credit for, making that new narrative because he doesn't deserve it.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other people who deserve a lot more. And what he was filling a void because nobody else in the North was talking about it. So good for him to that extent. But there are plenty more people from the global South who've been saying these things for decades and haven't been listened to. Right?
Yeah.
Latin America is the region that really brought this idea of sovereignty and non-intervention into international law. That was Latin America that brought that idea to the world. Right? There's a whole lot to be said for, delinking for South-South cooperation, but also just reconfiguring what it means to share a world. And we're at a point where we can actually do something new here because the old model is so clearly um, expired.
Yeah.
It's expired. So we're at an interesting moment here.
Yeah.
And it just requires the humility to listen outside of the U.S. bubble and to listen to voices from the global South, including Mexico, but not only, because there have been people here who have been thinking about and trying to do things from a different perspective for a long time.
Yeah. Your country gives me hope every day. I had someone I was on a panel, Virtuous Con. It's a Comic Con for people of color. And it was a virtual thing. So last week, and they asked me what gave me hope. And I think I said this part out loud, but Mexico gives me hope like every single day because I'm looking at it going, again, y'all been through some shit. And but here we are, you know, doing social programs that the left up here would like salivate over, right? If they were looking at it as far as like where we are in the US. Um and just the love of the people for their leaders right now, seeing the videos. Again, my husband's very well trained now on Claudia Scheinbaum, and he sends me videos of her like going through the country and being embraced. And I think you guys talked about the pizza that someone gave to her because they were like, like I cannot imagine somebody walking up and giving Trump a pizza. I cannot even conceive that in
It
my
just seems
mind.
totally out of our conception.
No, well, because you
Mm,
couldn't get past the
mm,
security detail for one
mhm.
thing.
But
Um,
anybody even wanting to do it.
right, yeah, exactly. Like no one's thinking that, but it's just like I want her to hug me. Sometimes I'm like, Claudia,
Mhm.
like, um, and so yeah, it's just I'm like, it's possible, right? And that's what is so wonderful to see. It's like this is possible. And I want people to look at Mexico as what we could all be, and not that we have to carbon copy each other's things. Like you guys are, you're a sovereign country, you have your own history and culture, and that should be celebrated, not necessarily like, co-opted, but just the general idea of like a government for the people by the people. We say that's what we have here in the US. Right now it's a government for the oligarchs by the oligarchs. Like that's clear. So I strive for something different up here, and y'all give me so much hope. So that is there's my closing statement for the evening. Well, gentlemen, oh gosh, did we lose Jose Luis? I think we did.
No, no. Oh, maybe it froze. Yeah.
Partly. Okay. Hopefully it comes back on. Um, I do appreciate both of y'all's time. I said it would be an hour. Of course, I went over, but it was y'all are fascinating, and I love to hear everything that you have to say about what's going on in Mexico and what's to come. Also, as you guys said, I do think we need to keep our eyes laser focused on Cuba
Yeah.
and be talking to our electeds in particular about what's happening there because it's unacceptable, and it does seem to be flying under the radar for whatever reason. So anyway, that being said, I hope you both have a great evening. And everyone who's been listening, thank you so much. I will send the recording out later as per usual. So you can share with friends and family, anyone who's been telling you about, you know, whatever the fairy tales that are told us about what Mexico is. I have several episodes now of this crossover with Soberanía, and I'll make sure to put links to all the things that Kurt and Jose Luis are up to so that you guys can follow them everywhere else. And but yeah, send this to those people who keep telling you that Mexico is this or that, the other thing, and give them something else to think about. So that's how we move the needle on all policies, foreign and domestic. So, all
Right.
right.
I'm heading back to the book fair.
All right,
So,
have fun. Thank you so much. Have a good night,
take
everybody.
care.